Each of you has received a threading draft. This is a thread-by-thread draft created in Fiberworks. Fiberworks generates the harnesses that you're supposed to thread on and the colors that you're supposed to use. The red lines I have added, as well as these little pencil hash marks, which I will explain in a minute. This red line in the middle indicates where the first warp chain ends. So the way you read this is you start in the upper right-hand corner, you read from right to left, then the next row you read from right to left, the next row right to left, right to left, right to left, and you end here. The color bars are up here, and that just tells you where you change your colors. Your colors may not be red, blue, blue, red, and gray, but you will decide what color will be in this position, which color will be in this position, and so forth. The little hash marks are marks I added as well. Those are indicating where you should twine your counting thread. You start here, you'll measure a few threads, then twine your counting thread. Then you'll measure an inch worth, which is 27 threads, and you'll twine your thread again. Then you'll measure the next 27 threads, twine, and so forth, until you get to the red line, which is where you'll end the first warp chain. The second warp chain starts here and goes along, and you'll see this is in full inches, 27, 27, 27, until the end there are a few threads left over. The reason for the few threads left over at the end and a fewer than an inch at the beginning is because I want that red line that's in the middle that indicates where the warp chain ends, first warp chain ends, to be in the exact middle. And I want full inches going out. For placement in the rattle, I want full inches going out from the center, and whatever's left over at the end is left over. The first thing you have to do to get your warp measured on the warping board is to make a guide thread. I take a cheap yarn, I fold it in half on one end, so I'm going to make an overhand loop. I take that loop that I've created, I wrap it around my fingers, and I pull the other end through, making an overhand loop that is large enough to fit over the peg on my warping board. Now I'm going to measure from one end, from this end of the loop. So I put this right at the end of the tape measure. I'm going to measure the length of my warp. When I get to the end here, and I've got my measuring, rather than making the loop at the very end of the tape measure, I leave a little bit of extra at the end, like this, because when you make the knot, it's going to take up some. So now I'm going to make my overhand loop on this end. I make a loop, I fold it over my fingers, pull the knot snug, but leaving a loop big enough to go over the peg at the bottom of the warping board. So now I have to find a path on the warping board. I start the guide thread at the upper left peg, because we're going to be making our cross, or I'm going to be making my cross up here. So I start this here, and I follow a path along the pegs so that I can get the other loop put onto a peg that's convenient for me. And this, I would rather have my loop somewhere else. So I'm going to make a little extra slack here, and then keep following, and then yes, this will get me to this last peg. I push this back, and this is going to be the guide for all of your warp ends. Before I begin, I tack my draft up here above my warping board so that I can follow it, because there are many color changes in this particular draft. I've also marked the center, and I've done this on your drafts as well. I've marked the center because we're going to be making 2 warp chains for this warp. The warp is a little over 8 inches wide, and I never put more than 6 inches in one warp chain, and I like to have them evenly divided. So we're going to divide this one right down the middle, so you have about 4 inches, a little over 4 inches in one chain and 4 inches in the other. I have my colors arranged down here, and the first color I'm going to start with is this purple. So I'm going to make, here again, it's another kind of loop, but this one's a slip knot because I want to be able to take it out later. So I take my yarn, I wrap it around my fingers. I have the short end in my left hand and the long end in my right hand. So I take this and I wrap it around my fingers, and I just pull the loop through. and that makes a slip knot, which I would be able to pull out later. Short end in the left hand, long end in the right hand, wrap it around your fingers and pull a loop through. That's how I start this. I'm going to put it on this bottom peg. I always start on the end away from the cross because I want only complete loops up here. I don't want any loose ends up here. So I'm going to follow my path. My draft says for 19 threads. Oh no, it's 17 threads, sorry. And I just keep following the path, going around the peg on either end. At the cross, in case you've forgotten, at the cross, you're going to make your cross here, so you're going to go over to this peg, under this peg, and then around the end peg, and then you're going to go over this peg and under. So your mantra is over, under, over, under. I like measuring the warp, but facing the warping board and not twisting back and forth with my body. So I use my left hand to go around the pegs on the left and my right hand to carry around the pegs on the right. So I'm just passing the yarn back and forth between my two hands. The tension on the warp, I like snug tension, but most important, it needs to be even tension. When I change colors, I just cut the first color and tie on the second color. That's, for me, is the easiest thing to do. Especially if you've got 2 or 3 or 4 colors, it gets really awkward trying to wrap around an extra peg and carry it up later. It's just easier and time saving to cut it and start again. Tie on the new color and start again. So now I'm going to stop and count because I haven't been counting. So I put my fingers in the cross. This is something I wish you could see up close. I put my fingers in the cross like this. And I have my, the cross is at the first knuckle of each finger. Now if I straighten out my right finger in this case, no yarn comes off. I can take my finger out of there and nothing pops off. If I straighten out my left finger, 1 yarn pops off. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going back and forth, straightening my left finger, right finger, left finger, right finger, left finger. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 so far, and I said I needed 17. So I'm going to continue. So this will be 13 going up. I tend to count as I go so that when I recount, I have some confidence that I've counted correctly. So this will be 14, 15, and this should be 16. Pushing everybody back. I will park it down here by wrapping around the peg several times. Usually 6 or 7 times, and you have to wrap on top of the yarn, not as opposed to just coming out the peg, otherwise it'll slip. So that's 16 threads, and now I'm going to change to my teal. My scissors here, and I pick up the teal. It's convenient to have your cones arranged down here with a cone winder, a cone holder. I'll show you that later. But you can manage if you don't have that. So now I'm going to take this park thread off, and I'm going to lay the new thread on top of it. So I have maybe 4 inches from the peg coming this way. So now I can cut the old thread, this first thread, even with that one. Now I'm going to hold these under tension, and I'm going to hold my finger about where the peg is. I come off the board, I wrap this around my finger, and I tie a slip knot. So that when I park this, put this back over the peg, that slip knot is on or near that peg. And I only need 2 teals, so I'm going to go up, up. I have an extra pair, a little piece of thread there. Up, up, 1, 2, and I'm going to park this one. As you go, you're going to be putting in a counting thread. I like shoelaces. I get really cheap long shoelaces, and I cut them into 2 or 3 pieces. It's a cheap way, and they last forever. I have some here that are 30 years old. So I'm going to count my threads in the what's going to go in the rattle, or an inch. So you're going to bundle these in groups of an inch. So this first group on mine, because I want the groups to end at the center, in the whole inches at the center, I've actually left less than an inch on the edges, so that the 2 warp chains will have, the first warp chain will have extra threads at the beginning, and then whole inches up to the center, and then the next one will have whole inches up to the end, and then there will be leftover threads. Unless you In this case, I have 18 threads left over at each end. So the reason I do this is because it helps center things in the rattle without counting threads. It's very difficult to count threads at the rattle. Now, if you're going on from front to back, this really doesn't make any difference. You can count your 27 threads for the first 5 inches, and then whatever's left over is left over at the halfway point. If you're going on from the back and you're spreading it in the rattle, it's much easier to leave the leftover threads on the edge. Now I'm going to switch to the variegated yarn. So I grab that one, take my scissors, so I'm ready. I can pull this off. I can lay the end of the new yarn over top of the old yarn, clip them, and now I'm going to slide my fingers down near the peg, pull it off the peg, and while this is still under tension, tie my slip knot and continue. I count 1, 2, now if you had to make a color change at the peg at the top, you would just stop, do the same thing. You would park it here, tie a knot, and continue with the new color. You may end up at the top peg if you find a knot in your thread. If you find a knot in your thread, you should always go back to the last end peg, which is either the one down here or the one up here, because you don't want a knot in the middle of your warp. So I'm going to continue in this way, changing colors as my draft tells me to. Sometimes it's easier to take your draft and make a little chart. I need 18 of this, and 2 of this, and 20 of this, and 2 of this, and so forth. So I will continue in this way, changing colors until I reach the halfway point, and then we'll come back. When I'm done measuring a warp, I take my counting thread, I tie this in a bow, And then I'm going to tie off my cross, and I'm going to make choke ties every yard or so along the warp. So for tying off the cross, this you can tie in just a bow. You don't want them to be super loose, but they don't have to be choke tight. Right here, that's these two arms of the cross, and then I'll tie off these two arms of the cross. Make sure you do not catch your guide thread in your shoelaces, because you're going to need the guide thread for the second chain. Now I'm going to pull this out a little bit from the guide thread so I don't accidentally catch that. And there is this choke tie right here. I tie this, I like on this board, it's about 18 inches back from the cross. So I wrap this around once, twice. I pull it really snug, and then I tie a surgeon's knot, which is just like the beginning of a shoelace knot, except you go around twice instead of once. Snug that down and tie a bow or a half bow. Do the same thing every yard or so along the warp. And it's easier actually to start at the bottom, because then the shoelaces don't get in your way. So I'm going to do a choke tie here. Really snug, because you want to, this is what's going to keep your threads all organized. I'm going around once, twice, pull it snug, surgeon's knot, going around once, twice, pull it snug, tie a bow. Take them out as you wind the warp on. Once, twice for the surgeon's knot, tie a bow. And then we're going to chain this off. I'm going to just clip this close to that end post, and I'm going to slide this warp off. Oh, there's one thing I didn't do yet. I like to preserve, there's two things I do. First thing, I don't need it in this case because I don't have a false cross, but occasionally when you're measuring a warp, if you go around the peg the wrong way, you could end up with a little fake cross in here. It's called a false cross. And it's important to know that, because you don't want, your apron knot has to go in here in the space next to this peg, not in this space over here if there's a false cross in there. So I put a stocking loop, or you could put another shoelace right here just to make sure that that is preserved. And then down here at this end, in the end, after you've wound on, you're going to have a lot of ends to cut and a lot of things to untie. So I like to make sure I know where that loop is. So I put a shoelace loop here. This is a little lark's head. Take the the stocking loop around like this and pull one end through the other. And then this way, I know where that loop is later when it's time to cut these. Otherwise, you're cutting 200 loose loops. So now I can slide this off. And there are many ways to do this. I like to wrap it around my wrist like this. So I put my wrist on top, put this short end over, and then I grab the warp chain and I pull it through the loop. I slide my hand back through there, I pull it through. Slide it. It's like crocheting, a single chain. I do not chain very tightly. Some people chain beautiful tightly. They usually do that if they're not using choke ties, but because I have choke ties, it does not matter if this is loose or tight. And I'll chain all the way up to that last choke tie, but I don't include the cross end. Now I'm going to take this to the loom